When Diana realized that it was too late to call, it was already past midnight. She silently prayed that it was Marty's phone. Annoyed, she buried her face in the pillow and exhaled a grateful thank you. When the call finally ended, after 5 rings, just as she started to get comfortable, the bell rang once more. Disappointed, she cried out in frustration and opened her eyes. Martin picked up the phone. Her words were suddenly interrupted. When she woke up, she noticed that her husband was not in their bed. Glancing at the clock, which showed 3:37 a.m., she reached for the phone on the bedside table, wondering at its disappearance. Just a few hours ago, he was by her side when they went to bed. Confused, she answered the phone muttering, "Hello? Who is this?" The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Lisa Johnson? Are you Tom Johnson's wife?" "Yes, of course. Who am I talking to?" Diana asked Mrs. Miller. "I'm calling call-in from the emergency department of the North City Medical Center. Your husband was in an accident and was delivered about an hour ago. We have your contact information from the previous incident. Can you come to the hospital right now?" The man on the other end of the line asked, "Oh my God. Is he okay?" Diana exclaimed excitedly, "I can't tell you the details over the phone. Ma'am, please come as soon as possible." The same voice replied, "Yes, of course I will come as soon as possible." Diana replied. She hurried up the stairs where her daughter Emily was fast asleep. Dallas, named after the city where she was conceived, studied at a local university but decided to live at home to cut costs. Although she enjoyed living in a dorm in her freshman year, she soon realized that living closer to campus would be more beneficial for her studies. "Dal, wake up," she whispered, gently, shaking her daughter by the shoulder, but Emily was still fast asleep. "Emily, wake up." Diana's voice broke through the haze of sleep. Emily sat up, abruptly squinting against the harsh light in the room. His mother's words slowly came back to him. "Your father was in an accident. He's in the emergency room. You need to get dressed. We have to go in a panic." Emily threw back the blankets and jumped out of bed. He hastily pulled his nightgown over his head, ignoring the fact that he was standing naked in front of his mother. Diana was too busy getting out her clothes for Emily to notice. Emily dressed quickly, and anxiety for his father flashed through his mind. He followed his mother out of the room, his heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. After getting dressed, both women rushed to the hospital. Emily kept asking her mother about what happened, but Diana couldn't find any answers. It seemed like the journey took forever, but in fact with little traffic. It only took about 10 minutes. When they arrived, they were directed to Martin's room in the emergency department, where they were amazed by his appearance. He was heavily bandaged and did not react in any way to what was happening. Despite their grief, they were given papers to fill out. Even in times of grief, it is impossible to avoid bureaucratic procedures. Emily pulled her chair closer to her father, seeking comfort in his presence. They sat in silence for about an hour before a man and a woman dressed in police uniforms entered the room. "Good evening, ma'am." The woman introduced herself, identifying herself as Officer Smith, with her partner Officer Brown standing next to her. "We were the first to arrive at the scene. Is there any news about his condition?" Diana shook her head, her voice full of concern. "No one has told us anything yet. Officer, this is my daughter Emily." She added. The officers exchanged glances and then turned back to the family. "We need to ask you a few questions," Officer Stanton said softly. "I understand that now is not the right time, but it is important for the investigation. Can you clarify what your husband was doing outside at that time?" The officer asked. "Actually, he was at home with me and we went to bed around 10 p.m. I didn't know he was gone until I got a call from a hospital officer standing asked Emily. "Ma'am, can you confirm this?" "Yes, we watched a movie on TV which ended at 10:00 and then everyone went to bed. I saw Dad go into Mom's bedroom." She replied. "Do you know which movie you watched?" The officer asked. "We watched an action movie with actor X." The daughter replied. "Did he have to overcome many personal problems? Maybe financial difficulties or marital problems?" The officer asked. "The usual problems that arise in marriage, nothing unusual, but I was puzzled as to why he left the house without warning me." Diana asked, were the passengers of the other car injured? That's the point, Mrs. Miller. He replied it was an isolated incident. Two witnesses claimed that your husband's car was working normally before inexplicably accelerating and crashing into a large oak tree at the intersection of highways 121 and 288. There were no signs of attempted braking. The officer said Diana and Emily were shocked by the officer's assumptions. Are you suggesting that my husband deliberately caused this accident? Diana asked, we need to inspect the car for mechanical malfunctions that could have caused the accident and also talk to your husband when he regains consciousness. This is definitely a possible factor that we are considering. The officer replied. Are you sure there weren't any problems with the car that you should have talked about? The officer asked. I assure you, my husband and I have a strong and loving relationship. I can't remember a single problem that could have caused the accident. I think it's just the result of him losing control or maybe falling asleep, especially considering the late hour. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for this. Diana replied. Diana's tears flowed uncontrollably, preventing her from finishing her sentence. Officer Stanton put one of her cards on the table, urging them to contact them if they remembered any additional information, and quietly left the hospital room. Emily closed the door to Martin's room and turned to his mother with a questioning look. You didn't tell them what's the matter. What is it? She asked. No, Emily, I didn't. His mother replied when her tears subsided. This does not concern them and has nothing to do with the situation. Your father didn't mind. Maybe you'll bring it up when they talk to him. We can only wait and see. The following days dragged on. For a very long time, Martin was still in a coma, hospitalized and under the care of Diana and Emily. They took turns keeping watch at his bedside, making sure that he was never left unattended. Diana contacted Martin's boss, explained the situation to him, and informed him about Martin's absence from work. The accident happened on Saturday evening, and it was only on Wednesday morning that Martin began to recover. By noon, his eyes had opened, although he still couldn't fully focus. Diana, who was next to him, noticed this change and went to his bed to calm him down. A minute later, a nurse burst into the room, alerted that the monitor showed that the patient was waking up. Diana moved away to give the nurse the opportunity to take care of Martin. Soon his condition began to improve. More doctors entered the room to assess Martin's condition. Seeing the free time, Diana slipped outside to call Emily and inform her about her father's awakening. Although Emily didn't respond, Diana left a voicemail with the news when they began to take away the medical equipment. It turned out that Martin's left arm was broken. Although being right-handed, it did not interfere too much. In addition, his throat was irritated by the tube, so the medical staff provided him with a communication board. The nurse read the message and asked if he was sure. Martin nodded. The nurse hurried out into the hallway while the tests continued. Mrs. Miller, I regret to inform you that your husband has asked that you and your daughter not be allowed to enter his room. She said. Mrs. Miller was stunned and exclaimed, What, he's my husband? I have every right to be with him. I understand, Mrs. Miller, but the patient wishes come first. The nurse explained, Please let me talk to him. We can sort this out. Diana tried to squeeze past the nurse, but to no avail. In desperation, she had to scream, Martin. Martin, please talk to me. What's going on? The nurse interrupted her, scolding her for interfering with other patients. Mrs. Miller, please stop shouting. If you want, you can wait outside the ward, but if you try to enter or make noise, you will be asked to leave the building. Do you understand? Diana nodded understandingly, realizing that she had no choice but to comply. 45 minutes later, Emily arrived at the hospital and saw her mother sitting on a chair at the entrance to the ward. Confused, she asked Mom, Why are you here? Why did Dad forbid us to enter the ward? The mother hesitated before replying. Well, he forbade me, but I don't understand why he forbade you, and why did it take you so long to get here? Emily explained, I just woke up when John Lay came to check on me. Instead of being with your father, you decided to make love to your boyfriend. I understand that he was unconscious when you left, but it still shows what your priorities are. Diana said threateningly. Emily replied in an indifferent tone, not at all remorseful for her actions. She justified her decision by saying that she needed to relax after a stressful situation, and it worked. She advised her mother to also find time to relax in this way, but the mother categorically refused this offer, saying that it was not something she would have done. She also stated that now is not the time to discuss this issue, as it is disrespectful. Emily couldn't help but laugh at the irony of the situation. A tall, stunning brunette appeared at the knock on the door, dressed professionally but not like a doctor. Despite this, her badge identified her as Dr. Lasser, a mental health specialist at the hospital. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she greeted him. "How are you feeling?" "I think it's good as expected." It's been 9 days since the accident. He finally found the ability to speak. The outdated board was no longer used. He asked about the date of his discharge but did not receive a clear answer. "Despite this, the hospital asked me to talk to you. Is this acceptable?" The doctor asked, "Do I have a say in this matter?" He asked not. "If you want to be discharged as soon as possible in order for you to leave, I have to discharge you." The psychiatrist replied with a puzzled grin. "Then Leighton get started," Martin said. Dr. Lasser pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down elegantly, crossing her long legs. After a few minutes of looking through the papers, the doctor spoke. "So it looks like you were hospitalized a little over a week ago after an accident with a large tree. I also noticed that you asked your wife and daughter not to visit you, and this leads me to believe that there may be some connection between these two events." Martin nodded back. "She cheated on me," he confessed. The nurse sighed, acknowledging that infidelity unfortunately is common but rarely leads to such extreme measures. "Is there anything else in this story?" "What is it?" she asked. Martin sat in silence for what seemed like an eternity. The last thing he wanted to do was open up about his feelings, as especially to a beautiful woman like Dr. Lasser. He wished he had an older male therapist he could trust. But Dr. Lasser remained calm and understanding, giving him a chance to collect his thoughts. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Martin found the courage to speak. "I think I was depressed," he admitted quietly. "There was no official diagnosis, but I just felt good, probably lost. I haven't had the desire to engage in intimacy for over a year." Martin said it all started after that incident, right? The doctor asked. She probably knew about his medical history. She probably had access to all the records. She just wanted him to admit it. To tell the truth, it wasn't even an accident. "I was a passenger in the back seat when we were hit from behind. My boss was in the front passenger seat and his boss was driving. There were no airbags to protect us," he began. "I didn't expect to get such severe damage, but unfortunately it happened. I accidentally hit my head on the seat in front of me, which I believe was the cause of the injury. According to the report, I received a blow to the head and a slight concussion. Despite numerous tests and medications, the doctors were unable to give a clear explanation for my condition. It seems that a part of my brain has been damaged, as a result of which I cannot achieve arousal in general. My wife became dissatisfied with our intimate life, which eventually led to her having an affair. This situation had been wearing me out for 7 or 8 months before the events of that evening happened. We tried to solve our problems in other ways, but in the end it wasn't enough. I know that there are certain types of assistants who can help in situations like this. I've already had the experience of intimacy, although I admit I'm a little embarrassed to talk about it at first. We hoped that everything would work out and fantasized about spending the whole weekend in bed together enjoying each other's company. Unfortunately, this never happened. In the end, she began to seek satisfaction elsewhere without telling me in advance. I only found out about it when I unexpectedly returned from work ahead of time. It may seem like a platitude, but it was a shocking revelation. She was at home not only with her lover, but also with my daughter and her boyfriend. There was disbelief in Dr. Lasser's voice when she asked did they do this together. Fortunately, no. Diana and Mike were in the bedroom and Sarah and John were in the living room. That's how I found out about my wife's infidelity and that my daughter was aware of it and didn't seem to mind it. He replied that was the reason you forbade your daughter from visiting you, right? She asked yes. Oh, and if I haven't mentioned it before, Bill is John's father. We met him by chance as the father of our daughter's boyfriend. Later it turned out that it was our daughter who recommended Mike to her mother. This revelation came as a surprise to me. He said, "Have I discussed this situation with them?" Not quite. I was thinking of approaching Diana, but I have already witnessed more of my daughter's personal life than I would like, so I decided to leave. The explanation that followed was not at all what I expected. He said, she regretted that I was aware of the situation, but stressed that if I could not meet her needs, then she would have to look for a permanent partner. She preferred to have someone by her side all the time rather than being in constant search of a new partner. Mike, who was single and had similar needs, became her chosen one. What could I do in response? Indeed, I couldn't give her what she needed in terms of physical intimacy. It wasn't her fault, and she was just doing what was necessary for her own well-being. If she had hypothetically asked you about it beforehand, would you have answered yes? The doctor asked. I've been thinking about this question for a long time, torn between my love for her and my own happiness. In the end, I realized that I couldn't go through with it. We made vows and promises, including a commitment to support each other in sickness and in health. I couldn't betray her, and I couldn't accept the thought that she would do the same to me. He replied, despite this, did she continue to date him? The doctor asked. Now that I found out about it, she turned out to be less restrained. I can't say for sure if she started doing it more often because I didn't know how often it happened before, but it used to happen only during the day when I was at work. Now that includes weekend shopping, some of which she obviously spent with Mike. He replied it must have been difficult. The doctor asked knowingly. It doesn't even come close to describing the situation, and yet I felt powerless to do anything. She deserved a full-fledged intimate life, but I couldn't handle it. The weight of it was suffocating me. Let me tell you about the evening of the accident. The whole family gathered to watch a movie on TV. I tried to hide my heartache by keeping her locked up. It seemed to me that it was better not to burden Diana and Emily with their worries, as they exchanged kisses and hugs before going to bed. I received a simple good night from Emily. At that moment I realized that she had lost all respect for me as a father and a man. It was hard to blame her for such actions, considering that I didn't think too highly of myself either. Like Diana, I went to bed as usual. The monotony of what was happening was almost suffocating. Every evening, everything happened the same way. As soon as Diana fell asleep, I dressed quietly, took my wallet and keys and went upstairs to check on Emily. When I saw that she was sleeping peacefully, I kissed her and said goodbye, and then I went to the car. As I got into the driver's seat, I couldn't help but notice the airbags, a reminder that there is protective equipment in the car. I believed that if the blow was strong enough, nothing would change. I didn't have a definite plan. I just drove aimlessly around the neighborhood. When I first came across a large oak tree, I noticed the absence of obstacles in a clear path. After circling around him once more, I headed towards him. The man finished his story. They sat in silence for a few moments, each replaying his story in his head. Finally, the doctor broke the silence. Mr. Miller, I appreciate your openness and honesty with me. This is quite unusual. I'll give you time to think about what you've shared with me. Is it okay if I come tomorrow? The doctor asked. I'm not going anywhere. He replied with a touch of sarcasm. They shook hands and Dr. Lasser left the room. Martin took his phone, which he had left at home earlier in the evening, in which Diana had kindly brought to him, despite his protests, and replied to numerous messages and emails. He also informed his boss about the latest developments. Finally, he closed his eyes and tried to rest for a while. When Diana returned home, she tried her best to keep her composure. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marty didn't mind her meeting Bill, as if he allowed it as a sign of his love for her. At first, Diana considered what had happened to be a simple accident, but as doubts crept into her soul, her confidence wavered. She was afraid that the authorities might question her husband, fearing that he would reveal details of her relationship with Mike. The police did not contact her again, deciding that extramarital contact was technically not a crime. Perhaps they decided it was an accident and closed the case anyway. She didn't care, and if there was, she couldn't remember, and she certainly wasn't going to refrain from physical intimacy just because someone had falsely accused her husband's boss. This was not the life she had agreed to, and she certainly wasn't going to agree to it right now. When Martin returned home, she decided that she would be more attentive to his feelings and more restrained in dealing with Mike, but she wasn't going to give up. The next morning, Dr. Lasser came as promised. Martin noted the changes in the doctor's appearance, but unfortunately Marty remained withdrawn. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Miller?" Dr. Lasser asked. "Nothing has changed since yesterday. Doctor, I'm ready to go home, but it looks like the decision is in your hands." Martin said, "Well, at least partially. Unfortunately, according to state law, you must be detained for 72 hours. The countdown started with yesterday's conversation, so we have a couple more days. But the food here is not too terrible." They giggled together. "I'm glad to see that you don't lose your sense of humor." "She remarked me too," came the reply. "It has been quite a long time, or rather several months, since I really felt like myself. I used to be quite a joker and often got on Emily's nerves with my antic." He replied, "Have you had any disturbing thoughts lately? Maybe there are some hidden dark corners in your mind that we have yet to explore." The doctor asked. "You see, Doc, everything has changed. I've been struggling with feelings of depression for a year now, but recently those feelings have changed. Now, instead of sadness, I am filled with anger and disappointment. I feel that Diana and Emily have let me down, especially Diana, but first of all I am disappointed in myself for not showing self-control and not letting my wife know that her behavior is unacceptable. Will I take a position now? Definitely, although the idea of divorce is very tempting, I am aware of my role in making it happen. If she agrees to end a relationship with Mike, I am ready to go to a psychologist and work on restoring our marriage." He said, "I have to pay tribute to your tenacity, Mr. Miller. It is not often that I witness such an amazing transformation in such a short period of time." The doctor noted, "During the time that I spent here lying down before a meeting, I had enough opportunities to reflect on my thoughts. I am grateful for the chance you gave me to share them with someone, which allowed me to clarify and organize my thoughts." He replied, "Your behavior in this situation was truly outstanding, Mr. Miller. That's why I decided to end our conversation for today. I'll drop by tomorrow for a final conversation, but I don't see any reason why you can't leave as planned." She concluded. "Ed, I can't wait for this, Doc," he replied. Marty knew that if he wanted change, he had to start by acting like change was inevitable. The airbags proved to be extremely effective and exceeded Marty's expectations. The most difficult aspect of the accident was the concussion he received, which required a long rest in a dark, quiet room, turning off the TV and turning on calm music. Marty's wife and daughter surrounded him with care and attention. Everything went smoothly for a little over a week, until Diana suddenly announced that she needed to go shopping. "No, Martin," he replied calmly. "What do you mean?" "No," Diana asked in disbelief. "There are basic necessities, including your healing creams. Make a list for Emily to go in your place." Marty ordered. "Why are you dragging me into this? Dad, I already have plans for a meeting with John Lay." Diana protested. "Well then, you have extra motivation to make purchases faster, don't you?" Marty replied when Diana reluctantly started making a list. "This is hilarious, Martin. You can't just barge in here and disrupt everything. Emily and I have our own rules and only I go to the store, period." Diana replied, "Do you really think I'm naive?" "Diana," he asked, naive. "No, Marty, that's not what I meant. Why are you suddenly doubting me?" She asked indignantly. "Do you really think I don't understand that these grocery shopping trips are just an excuse to see Mike?" He sarcastically remarked. "I've never come home without groceries yet." Martin, Diana replied angrily. "Of course it's a great alibi, but you've been away too long and I see right through you. Marty summed up, when you avoid looking me in the eye, when your outfits don't seem right to you, when your makeup looks a little wrong, it means that something has changed." He said the time spent with Mike was a thing of the past, and Diana's shocked expression only emphasized this fact. Marty continued, "At that moment, Emily couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for her father. Marty, please, we've already talked about this." She pleaded, "I will try to be more careful in the future. I think I was being too casual, but I'm not going to let that stop me. I have every right to a full-fledged intimate life and I intend to lead it." Diana exclaimed, "Don't our marriage vows mean anything to you, each other and sickness and in health? Leaving others is not an option when faced with difficulties." Diana said, "Marty, and yet you're here preferring to date someone else. It's time to make a choice. Either we end our relationship with Mike and work on our marriage with a psychologist, or on Monday I turn to a divorce lawyer. He said threateningly, "You have no right to suggest such a thing. Mart Miller, don't even think about threatening me. If only I could have intimacy with you and no one else." Diana screamed. "It's unfair to accuse me of something I have nothing to do with. Just because you had an accident doesn't mean that my love life should be ruined. I refuse to accept it. Instead, I'm going to go shopping, meet Mike, and attend to my own needs. If you want to discuss it tonight, we can, but don't try to control or limit my actions," she said, saying this to her husband. Diana ran out of the house, slamming the door with such force that the windows shook. The silence that followed was disturbing. Father and daughter exchanged worried glances, after which Martin retired to his room. Emily Miller was worried about the future of her family, in particular about her parents' marriage. Her father had never come into conflict with her mother, and although disagreements between them were not uncommon, nothing seemed so serious. Deciding to leave this matter between her parents, Emily felt a sense of anxiety creep into her soul for the first time in her life. Unable to do anything, she gathered her thoughts and headed for John Lay Park. Part of Diana secretly wished that Marty would never fully recover because she wasn't sure she could let Bill go. Mike had domineering and dominating qualities that didn't quite suit her. He acted without hesitation, unlike Marty, who was always a gentle and caring person at dusk. Emily returned home and found her father resting in his room. A dim light coming through the slightly ajar bathroom door caught her attention. It dawned on her that her father must have turned on the light because none of the lamps in the room were so dim. "Dad," she whispered. He had his back to her, but answered without turning around. "Dad, I'm really sorry." Her words seemed to pierce his thoughts as he slowly sat up in bed and finally met the gaze of his daughter, who was crying quietly in the doorway. "What do you want to say? What is it?" he asked. Confused, he stopped using the affectionate nicknames he usually called her after he found out that she had helped her mother find a new partner. Even if she was crying, he didn't dare to do it now, feeling like it was all a trap. Emily came over and stood at the foot of the bed apologizing for her actions. She explained that she was just trying to help her mother, who was upset about his situation. Their gazes locked for a moment, confirming each other's unspoken understanding. John Lay's father was grieving the loss of Mrs. Coy. John Lay confessed to them that he constantly thinks about her and longs for her presence. It was natural to assume that they would find solace in each other's company. But at that moment it dawned on them. They had never thought about how their actions would affect another person. Wasn't that the reason for their actions? That night, Marty was stunned by his daughter's unexpected reaction. He couldn't help but wonder if this was all just a ruse, but decided to take her word for it. If he is eventually caught off guard again, insulted or betrayed, he will have to put up with it. But deep down he felt relieved. He struggled with his own emotions, unable to do what he desperately wanted to do. When their eyes met and they exchanged fleeting smiles, Marty assured his daughter that the past was behind them. He swore that he would never allow himself to be plunged into this darkness again. "I really hope so. I'm relying on you," she said. "Are you thinking about leaving Mom?" Emily asked. "I haven't made a final decision yet, dear, but it seems inevitable if she doesn't break up with Mike. Let's keep this between us. She has to change on her own, not because she is forced to." Martin said, "Okay, Dad, I'm going upstairs." "Oh, I broke off my relationship with John Lay today." Marty tried his best to hide a smile. He had never approved of this guy, and it was amazing to hear that she had fallen in love with him. "Why?" Marty asked, intrigued by the sudden confession. Emily started to explain, but hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because my dad once told me that John Lay wasn't good enough for me, and now I see that he was right. I realized that my father was right in many ways." A grin spread across Marty's face when he saw his daughter growing up in front of his eyes. Emily walked up to her father and hugged him tightly in a moment of awareness and gratitude. It dawned on them that these hugs were the first in a long time. Eventually, they let go of each other, exchanging smiles, and Marty watched as Emily quietly left the room and headed upstairs. As soon as Marty heard the click with which the car closed from the outside, the warm feelings that had gripped him disappeared. He lay down again, closing his eyes. Soon Diana came into the bedroom having taken a shower at Bill's. Mari advised her to come back after the shower so she wouldn't smell like another man. "Can you help with the groceries?" he asked. "What is it?" she asked. Marty jokingly replied, "Are there any products there at all?" "Yes, Marty. I told you I was going grocery shopping and I went," she replied. Marty took the bags out of the car and put them on the table, noticing that there were no chilled or frozen foods in them. He found a receipt with a Tim stamp indicating that she had left the store almost 2 hours ago. Marty realized that she had been shopping before meeting Mike. Despite the fact that he had expected this, the evidence he saw still amazed him. He silently put away his things and retired to the bedroom, wondering if it was worth investigating the situation. Diana had made her plans clear and now he had to decide what to do. Something had to be changed. "Do you want to discuss this further?" his wife asked. It was obvious from her tone that she did not believe that this would change anything. "No, Diana, you've made your position clear," he replied. Diana gave up. She treasured her husband and did not want to lose him. He was not only her spouse, but also the closest person she loved to spend time with the most. Given the circumstances, she did not think that seeking her own intimate satisfaction was the right decision. Diana knew there was going to be a problem and she wanted Marty to come to his senses and see it too. She nodded in satisfaction and went to the closet to choose an outfit. She was thinking about resuming intimacy with the husband she missed so much, but today was not the right time. When she was getting ready for said, Marty was already asleep, or at least that's what she thought. Diana was furious. When the divorce papers were filed, Marty, being prudent, sent them home and stayed with Emily, staying in the guest room upstairs next to Emily's room. Despite the fact that Diana was against the divorce, Marty hired a fierce lawyer who put a lot of effort into defending his interests. Anticipating Diana's next move, Marty took precautions and decided to be prepared for any further attempts on her part. The consultations began the same week. The paperwork was filed and Marty turned to a reputable psychologist. The psychologist confirmed that Marty was no longer at risk and the judge agreed with him. The quarrel could have continued, but Emily intervened just in time to prevent Diana from causing even more harm. Emily reminded her mother that Diana's needs should not be above the vows and promises she made. Life is not always fair, but sometimes the right things went out. She had to support her husband and endure his suffering by his side. Emily stressed that any further resistance would permanently destroy their potential mother-daughter relationship. Diana, faced with the prospect of losing both her husband and daughter, was forced to abandon her objections to the divorce. Their house was sold and Marty agreed to pay child support for several years, hoping that the court would appoint them regardless. Diana found a 2-bedroom apartment near her work and moved into it after the divorce was finalized. 8 months later, Martin was able to work full-time, but the bitterness of the divorce remained. Mike made it clear that his relationship with Diana was over. It turned out that he had several other women, which made Diana lose her attractiveness. Now that she was no longer married, Emily continued to split time between both parents while attending college. Over time, Diana began to pose as a victim and continued to blame Marty for the divorce once again. Emily heard from her mother that if only Marty had been more understanding. She raised her voice at her mother, doubting that she was thinking about their father's feelings. Marty entered the dimly lit club around 10:00 on Friday evening, seeking to escape from the confined space of his house. He was just looking for a brief moment of pleasure after ordering a rum and coke at the bar. He looked around the room and noticed a woman at the opposite end who seemed familiar to him, but he could not remember where he had seen her before. She was sitting with an almost empty glass of wine in front of her, dark brown hair cascading down her back, her dress barely covering her breasts. Marty studied her carefully and memories came flooding back. A smile played on his lips as he raised his glass and walked towards her. As he approached her, she raised her head and met his gaze. "Dr. Lasser?" he asked uncertainly. She looked into his eyes and studied his face for a while before showing signs of recognition. Marty began to doubt himself, wondering if he had mistaken her for someone else. "I'm leaving Dr. Lasser in the hospital in the real world. My name is Vicky," she replied. "It's been a long time and I'm sure you communicate with more patients than I do with experienced psychologists." She joked. "I remember names better than faces." She replied. Well, my name is Tom Johnson, he said. Vicky thought about that name for a moment, while Marty waited for her to admit defeat. He was watching her closely. He could have sworn he saw a spark light up in her mind. Ah, Mr. Miller, an unfaithful wife in a sudden encounter with a tree, if I remember correctly. She said you remember correctly, and I'm surprised we only talked a couple of times almost 2 years ago. What a coincidence. Would you like to join me? Marty motioned for the bartender to pour them another glass. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. What brings you here tonight? Are you dating someone? She asked, are you still married? I'm trying to get married. Vicky replied with a twinkle in her eyes, hinting at her true intentions. Mar raised an eyebrow, but I could swear that not so long ago I saw an amazing ring on your finger. Vicky sighed. Maybe it was there. Once my divorce has recently been finalized. I wore rings in a vain attempt to save my marriage, but it was clear that my ex-husband had other interests, for example a young cashier and her friends. And how are things in your marriage? Vicky asked. I'm sorry to say that I failed. Marty replied. God, are they still a couple? She asked. This may shock you, but I haven't followed my wife's relationship since the divorce. I have no idea. He replied, and please call me Marty anything but Mr. Miller. He begged, laughing. What did your wife call you? Vicky asked. Marty or Martin. He replied, would you like to dance? Martin asked, motioning to the bartender to keep an eye on their drinks. Taking Vicky by the hand, he led her to the dance floor, where they quickly found their rhythm to the cheerful music. When one fast song was replaced by a slower melody, they continued to dance, clinging to each other. Vicky put her arms around Martin's neck and he held her tightly, swaying to the beat of the music. As a man, Martin couldn't help but notice the lack of a bra. As soon as he saw Vicky, their eyes met for a moment before she rested her head on his shoulder. They remained in each other's arms when the second song began. Martin was fascinated by the feeling of intimacy with this stunning, fragrant woman. When the song ended, Vicky took advantage of the LOL to express her feelings. Martin, I'm tired of dancing, but I also feel incredibly lonely. She whispered softly in his ear. Why don't you take me home and do something about it? Martin gently took her hand and led her back to the bar, paid the bill and informed the bartender that the drinks were over. The bartender, not at all embarrassed, nodded understandingly. Since she arrived at the club in an Uber, they got to Martin's car and he drove them back to his apartment when they were seated. Martin asked Vicky, I know it's a little late to ask, but how much have you had to drink? She replied, just 1 glass of wine at the bar before you arrived. What's undermined? Don't worry, Martin. He drove into the underground garage and took the elevator to his floor. Vicky snuggled up to him all the time and they shared a few passionate kisses. As soon as the door closed, Vicky quickly took off her dress, exposing herself. Oh my God! Vicky, you look amazing! Martin exclaimed. Thanks, Martin. But are you going to just stand there and watch? Vicky asked. No way. I'm not here just to watch, he told Vicky with a mischievous smile. But first show me your bedroom, she asked. Martin took her hand and led her down the hall, grateful that Emily had gone to her mother's for the weekend. Do you have any contraceptives? Vicky asked. When they entered his room, Martin nodded, took out a small supply from the bedside drawer and put them on the bedside table. After more than an hour of intense and passionate lovemaking, they finally returned to reality. Martin was lying on his back and Vicky was curled up next to him, feeling full and satisfied. They did not fall asleep completely, but were in a state of relaxation, suspended between sleep and wakefulness. Martin, she whispered. Yes, he muttered as soon as he woke up. I just remember that this story mentioned a problem with making love. Do you remember that? Martin laughed softly. Oh yeah, now it's not a problem. Vicky's brows furrowed. What happened? Martin explained. A few months after the tree incident, I started to feel well different. The tingling sensation is the best I can describe. I think that these are the feelings that arise when a paralyzed limb begins to come to its senses. This feeling lasted for several weeks, despite the fact that we were still technically married. My wife and I had been living separately for some time. I did not consider it necessary to explain the situation to her, since it did not concern her. Over time, I began to experience morning cravings more often, sometimes even during the day. He said after 8 to 9 months, everything returned to normal. The doctor did not have a clear answer on how to explain the sudden improvement. Despite numerous tests and scans, they were unable to identify the specific cause of the changes. In the end, they decided it was a mysterious brain quirk. Maybe hitting a tree somehow fixed the situation. The truth remains unclear. It could have been a combination of a blow and a natural healing process of the brain. The exact reason may never be fully understood, he concluded. Then I consider myself, he said. I think it's okay if I stay the night. Vicky asked, so we're planning to get intimate again in the morning and then have breakfast together. Martin asked when they were ready to rest. Martin asked one last question, Vicky, do you think you're ready for a serious relationship? There was silence and Martin worried that he might have made a mistake and scared her. He half expected her to get out of bed and asked for a ride home, but there was no doubt about her attraction to him. It wasn't just her looks that attracted him. She had a sharp mind and he found her company pleasant. It wasn't love yet, but after the divorce she became the first woman he truly considered. Can we discuss this in the morning? She asked, of course. Good night, Vicky. He said good night, Martin. Vicky replied. Vicky woke up before Martin and saw that he was sleeping peacefully. Deciding to let him sleep, she took a shower and then went to the kitchen to cook breakfast. Martin's question caught her off guard as she was getting ready for bed. Although she was definitely attracted to him, the main thing for her was just to have fun. For several months now she had been telling herself that she was quite happy with the absence of a romantic partner, and in many ways it was true. With a steady job and friends, she didn't necessarily need a man. But deep down she couldn't deny that she really wanted companionship. But what would a decent man say when she told him the truth? Martin woke up to the smell of something delicious. He went into the kitchen and saw Vicky in the shirt he had worn the day before and an apron. I was going to make you breakfast. She said. It's too late. Martin replied with a smile. Well, you can invite me to lunch instead. Vicky suggested. She told him to take a quick shower and breakfast would be ready. When he returned 10 minutes later, Martin joined her in the kitchen while she was arranging the plates on the table. An omelette, several sausages, and a slice of butter toast appeared. I didn't know there were sausages in the freezer. Marty replied, laughing. I was hoping they could still be eaten. Vicky jokingly said. Martin tasted a piece and said it was very tasty. Breakfast was relatively quiet. Martin tidied up the kitchen while Vicky kindly cooked. They made small talk until they finished eating and loaded everything into the dishwasher. He looked at Vicky and asked, are you ready to talk? She hesitated for a moment before answering. Mostly. Listen, Vicky, he began. I don't want to complicate the situation or invade your privacy. If you only want a physical relationship, I'll understand. You don't owe me anything. She nodded in agreement. I just need to talk to you about something. Can we do this in the bedroom? I feel calmer there. They entered, twined their fingers and went into the bedroom where they sat opposite each other on the bed. Vicky squeezed Martin's hands tightly. Martin, despite the fact that we met in person only last night, I already consider you a wonderful person and I really like you, but I have to tell you something important. She began. I told you that my husband left me for a younger woman, and it's true, but the real reason he left is that I can't have children. He wanted to have his own family and didn't want to consider adoption. That's why he left in search of someone who can give him the desired children. He considered the absence of his own children to be a manifestation of inadequacy and me to be its cause. As for his feelings after the divorce, I can't say for sure. Vicky finished. Sadly, I'm already over 40. I have an adult daughter, so having children is not a hindrance for me. Martin replied. It's nice to hear that. I also want to be honest about what I'm not proud of. After the divorce, I was overcome by a feeling of self-doubt. I was getting old and my husband had just left me for a woman almost half my age. Vicky began to explain. I'm 37 years old if you're interested, she said cheerfully. The thought crossed his mind, but he never brought it up. They both laughed a little. I also felt a sense of incompleteness, if that makes sense. To be honest, I didn't feel like a real woman. How could I be considered a woman if I couldn't bear children? Vicky continued. I understand the skepticism, but that's how I really felt at that moment, and then I decided to prove my femininity. Vicky continued, if I couldn't satisfy my desire to have children, I decided to satisfy my desire to please men, often strangers. I adopted the image of a fatal and never refused an invitation to go home with someone who interested me. This went on for several months until I realized that it was harmful and sought help from a psychotherapist. Despite this, I continued to behave in this way, although not so often, until I reached a tipping point when I was able to free myself from it. Have you been doing something like this? She asked. He tried not to make any judgments and didn't want her to feel judged too. But last night she was undoubtedly as alert as a cougar. It was a fact. As a woman I have needs and sometimes I go outside to satisfy them, but now I have become pickier in my choices. She explained there were many times when I returned home alone and took the situation into my own hands. She said, I suppose I should be grateful that I meet your standards. Martin said, Martin, I really appreciate the time we spent together, and I appreciate your honesty. I would like to continue our relationship, but I want to be honest about my past experiences. I have recently been tested and fortunately all the results were negative. Currently I do not use contraceptives, but if necessary I can provide a certificate from my doctor. I think it would be nice for both of us to get tested and commit to being the only one for each other. Vicky said, and the words flew out of her mouth in a hurry. Martin sat in thoughtful silence for a few moments, making Vicky feel anxious and at the same time hopeful for his answer. We are becoming more and more familiar and it can be difficult to open up to someone new, but I decided to take a chance and open myself up. I am grateful that I did this, because now I have found a person who truly understands me and makes me happy. Thank you for sharing your story with me, Vicky. He replied. Many women experience the decrease in interest in sexual intercourse and prefer asexual forms of attachment. I thought that I would have to look for a woman much older than myself or wait a few years to find someone who would share my desires. When my libido recovered and everything seemed to be back to normal, I still didn't feel the best. I felt pressure to prove my masculinity by pursuing women for physical intimacy. I candidly share that I used to have a pretty high opinion of myself and considered myself quite a ladies' man. I was no more selective than anyone else. I've had a lot of women. I've had casual relationships without much thought. But in the end my luck ran out when I caught an unpleasant illness and I had to admit to the doctor that I didn't even know the names of my intimate partners. While undergoing therapy, I began to think about my actions and behavior. I haven't had an intimate relationship with a woman without protection for a long time, but I'm ready to take the test and commit to being the only one. Well, shall we try? Vicky asked, blinking her eyes, as she already knew the answer. I'm sure we'll try. Martin replied to a rhetorical question by lunchtime. Martin had run out of protective equipment. The expected meeting with Diana occurred after Martin and Vicky had been dating for about 3 months. Vicky and Emily had a strong relationship and they got along great. Although Marty and Vicky had their own house, they practically lived together and it was clear to everyone that marriage was not far off. They decided to go to a club designed for a more adult audience, where a DJ played tunes and the atmosphere was conducive to intimate conversations. The tables. Martin and Vicky chatted animatedly while sipping drinks and enjoying each other's company. The evening started off just fine. Vicky was surprised when Martin's smile disappeared and his gaze shifted to her. Curiously, she followed his gaze and saw Diana approaching their table. Martin's expression turned neutral as Diana's face lit up with a grin. Despite the passage of time, Diana still retained the bitterness of their divorce and was sure that she had done nothing wrong. Satisfying her intimate needs with another man when her husband couldn't satisfy them didn't make her feel guilty. Therefore, when she approached the table, her intentions were far from friendly. Marty, I'm so glad to see you. Diana said, sarcasm in her tone. Diana, this is Vicky. Vicky. Diana is my ex-wife. Martin reluctantly introduced them, wishing he didn't have to do this. Nice to meet you. Diana. Vicky said, I must admit I haven't heard anything about you. Vicky replied politely. Diana's response was full of bitterness, as she reminded him of their previous divorce. Yes, we got divorced. It's been over a year. My life is no longer your concern. Martin stated, firmly hinting that she should leave them alone. Diana quickly apologized, admitting that she didn't want to interrupt their date, but then she added, Vicky. I have to tell you something, what Vicky asked, looking at Martin and then returning her attention to Diana. I would not recommend that you continue to communicate with him. We broke up because he couldn't satisfy me in pastels anymore. Martin stared at Vicky, waiting for her answer. Vicky stifled a laugh and raised her eyebrows at Martin in disbelief. Is it true? You've never talked about it? She asked. Martin just shrugged, letting Vicky take the lead in their conversation. Diana believed that she had managed to destroy Marty's relationship as he had destroyed it with Mike. She was sure she had the upper hand, but her joy was fleeting. Remembering a recent meeting, she realized that what she had mistaken for a wish was actually something completely different. Her smile faded quickly when she saw Vicky and Martin exchange knowing glances. Diana was left perplexed by this turn of events. Wait, what are you saying, Marty? Are you saying this damn thing really works? Diana exclaimed. It turned out that Emily kept Martin's personal life a secret from her mother. During their chance meetings, Diana, as always, took the news like a champion. But how is this even possible? Have the doctors finally found a cure? She asked in disbelief. Martin and Vicky were silent, watching Diana's growing agitation. Come on, Marty, this question caused the collapse of my marriage. Diana could not calm down. I think I deserve an explanation of what went wrong. Diana demanded. Martin. Smile faded. Diana, it was your actions that led to the breakdown of our marriage, not my condition. You made a decision that eventually led to the breakup of our relationship, and as for what I do now that we're divorced, that's my business. You have no right to judge or demand answers from me. Yes, you can point your finger and say that my choice played a role in our breakup, but I wouldn't behave like this if things were different. Martin explained. Diana, something unexpected has happened. The doctors believe that all the problems that I had after the first accident just need time to heal. If you had been patient and supported me during my illness, as our vows promised, we would still be together. Marty said. Diana was speechless, stunned by such a revelation. I can't believe it. Maybe it's a gift from God, she whispered. Martin shook his head. He just wants us to keep our vows, he said quietly. Diana's eyes sparkled as she asked, do you think so now? Martin hesitated before replying. No way, I absolutely don't think so. Diana's expression softened and Marty asked, could you leave us alone for the rest of the evening? After a moment's thought, Diana met Martin's gaze and confessed. You were right. Marty, I made a mistake. I was selfish and I didn't have the foresight. I should have been more persistent. I ruined a happy marriage. I deeply regret my actions. Diana hurried away, leaving the table behind Martin, and Vicky watched her disappear from sight, and a feeling of pity filled their hearts. Martin then turned his attention to Vicky. Shall we dance, my love? They also watched as Diana spent the whole evening looking for a companion for the night, and at the end of the evening she left with a gray-haired man who was clearly 15 years older than Diana. It was clear that Diana was having a promiscuous sex life. 6 months later, Martin and Vicky exchanged vows and tied the knot. Emily had to deal with Diana's paternal problems. As it turned out, Diana was diagnosed with breast cancer, which greatly worried Emily. Of course, Marty comforted his daughter, hoping that everything would be fine with Diana. But deep down he realized that this was karma that befell a lying and evil woman.